Hello, welcome to the lesson on development, globalization and society. The today module is agrarian strategy, agrarian crisis and farmer suicides. This is a very contemporary topic and we will understand agricultural strategy in post-independent India and what led to the distress situation which is leading to farmers' suicide. It initially examined the agricultural strategy designed and implemented by the Indian state. This analysis will then be linked to the agrarian crisis affecting Indian agriculture, and finally will shift our focus to the farmer suicide happening over the country, primarily in the Andhra Pradesh, Punjab and other states. The analysis of the agricultural sector cannot be done within a historical vacuum. It is important to locate and theorize the link between the nature of the state, especially shift from welfare development model to a free market liberalized structure. We have to ask the question whether it has affected the primary sector, that is agriculture, and if yes, then in what ways? To understand Indian agricultural strategy, we need to realize that the Indian democratic structure was based on the perception that the strategy for development for India would be through positive intervention by the state. This intervention would be designed through the institution of planning and based on a strong commitment for public investment by the state to bring about development. Though planning was influenced by socialist ideal, it was a product of an anti-colonial nationalist movement. But Naik points out that it is important to locate the emphasis on planning as a strategy pursued by the Indian state to usher in the development of the nation. According to him, the experience of Great Depression had led to the questioning of the faith in the virtues of the free market. On the one hand, the trickle-down theory based on the rationale that a benefit of a strong market-based growth would slowly but surely reach to the larger public was being severely questioned. And on the other hand, it was gradually being realized that it is important to control the market for the greater good of the social justice. In fact, Keynesian ideology of state intervention in capitalist economy was becoming more and more attractive to policymakers, social scientists and the common layman. Why planning? What is the need for planning? Given the abject state of underdevelopment in India and the weak state of economy due to the free trade, free market policy, it was strongly argued that the Indian state should, through the instrument of planning, implement policies that would raise the living standard of the masses. The idea was to usher in growth with social justice. Hence, a socialist rhetoric was being institutionalized within agriculture through the planning process. For agriculture, emphasis was laid on public sector investment to strengthen the infrastructure and implementation of land reform, that is, redistribute land to the tiller, cultivator and thus go on to address the structural inequalities that were inherent in the system. The strategy for agricultural development primarily revolved around the following ways. First, to emphasize the integral role of public sector investment to usher in an era of development. Secondly, implementing of land reform that would fundamentally change the inequality embedded within the existing agrarian structures. Thirdly, creation of cooperative for credit, marketing and rural industry so that growth benefit would be spread among population at large. However, contrary to the vision of social justice, the policies of the Indian state led to deepening of inequalities, pushing people into the margins, especially the landless and the small-scale farmers. What led to the rise of these inequalities? Let's examine them one by one. The first was the failure of the land reforms. The land reform policy was only successful at eliminating very large zamindars, private landowners, and bestowed ownership right to the rich tenants. Rao and Storm argued that by not distributing the land to the tiller, whether landless labor, poor tenants or sharecropper, the policy created a more homogeneous class of landowners. There was a low priority assigned to agriculture. Priority for agriculture was reduced during the second and the third plan period. At that time, there was more emphasis on the industrial development, and these kind of inequalities were dangerous as the significance of agrarian inequality does not merely impact distribution of gains from growth, but the growth itself. As a result of all these conditions to combine to create a critical agricultural crisis of mid-1960s. New agricultural strategies during drought conditions of the mid-60s caused a big crisis all over India, and the government adopted new agricultural strategy. The stress now was on having different approaches to deal with the to increase agricultural productivity and vice versa decrease poverty. In other words, this plan emphasized an official policy separation of production goal for distribution outcomes. Thus, for increasing agricultural productivity, the technology-led process of growth supported by price incentive was institutionalized. On the other hand, for dealing with poverty, special poverty alleviation scheme was devised and implemented. Scholars have argued that NAS was aimed at increasing productivity by means of technological intervention. Its impact was the institutionalization of high capital technology based on viable agriculture. According to Rao and Storm, the post-independence agricultural crisis of the mid-1960s might have been triggered by the severe drought conditions of 1965 and 67, but its intensity worsened due to the neglect by policymakers of the strategic significance of agriculture in the poor industrializing economy. The new agricultural strategy included the adoption of new high-yielding variety seeds, investment in irrigation, fertilizer and pesticide, investment in crop, that is wheat. Region-wise, better endowed higher productivity areas and significantly lacked any institutional reform. The policy of redeployment of new technology for revitalizing agriculture based on high capital investment, dependence on subsidies and public investment did not really increase overall growth. Its unsuitability to farming practices in India resulted in an exploitative situation because, on one hand, the poor peasants pay high rates of interest for loans needed for investment in capital-intensive technology-driven crop, but faced insufficient and uncertain employment in the labor market. Slowly, we saw that there was a commercialization of agriculture and it had its fallout. Agriculture performance increased, but it simultaneously increased instability. Commercialization also caused regional unevenness. It increased regional unevenness with increase in regional concentration of crop supply based monocrop culture having extreme negative effects on the fertility of the soil. It resulted in a shift in crop pattern. The shift in cropping patterns toward higher yielding variety but more rainfall sensitive crop rendered the farmers dependent on nature, making them vulnerable. Such a capital intensive farming pattern with no guaranteed return has made the rural poor, particularly in the drought prone areas, and they continue to suffer income and employment fluctuation and also undergo food crisis in times of severe drought conditions. Thus, rural inequality has risen over time, which is reflected in the increased casualization of agriculture work, and among poorest households, one can observe that there is a process of employment diversification into non-agricultural based work. Scholars have argued that agrarian economy of India is in a state of stagnation. Agricultural distress in India has three dimensions. The first one is uninspiring growth. Agriculture in India is defined by fall in productivity from almost all crops from the mid-1990s. In situation where the value of output from agriculture is steadily decreasing as the rate of growth of agriculture output has slowed down after the reform. So we can understand that the liberalization policy and nature of agrarian crisis are closely related. Harrison White argues that it is the small peasant and landless agriculture laborer who form the great mass of the rural workforce. Such a process is represented in the form of labor dualism, which reflects in the growing number of small and marginal farmers to shift from self-cultivation to landless agricultural laborers, highlighting declining incidence of self-employment with agricultural workforce. Small and marginal farmers are committing suicide. The jobless growth in agriculture, the steady decline in farm size, and farmers committing suicide due to high debt incurred by capital-intensive, non-viable crop defines in a nutshell the agrarian policy since the adoption of a neoliberal policy in India. The shift of priorities of the Indian nation-state in the decades of the 1980s and 1990s and the post-reform experience of 1990s has led to the accentuation of regional disparities. Liberalization of agriculture limited the role of public policy to guarantee minimum support price for farmer. The pace of liberalization of agriculture had to be complemented and supported by factors such as irrigation, waterside development, research and extension, accessibility of credit for agricultural production, and increase in income earning opportunities. Impact of agrarian crisis on women farmer. Let's examine how this impact affected the fairer gender. Women today are the core to the agrarian economy, undoubtedly. They form predominantly the rural subsidiary and the casual worker. Krishna Rajan Shah states that the face of the farmer in India is female, thereby emphasizing the centrality of women's work in agriculture. The heavy work burden and an unequal return to the labor. The unsustainable nature of agriculture pushes, Krishna Raj argues, that independent land rights for women may not be a panacea as was earlier argued by gender and development scholars. The situation of a woman is a state of pauperization despite owning the land. Vepa argues that whenever agricultural distress hits any region, the first victims are the women. It affects them in several ways, namely through increased work burden, higher debt, repayment burden, and reduced consumption and less spending on healthcare. Agriculture in this era of globalization is undergoing a number of changes, and most of it impacts women who are sole principal earners of their household, especially widows, surviving farmer, suicides left behind face a daunting task. The decreasing return from agriculture are pushing the farmer to multitask earning opportunities to stay above the poverty line and not to face starvation. Situation Assessment Survey of Farmer 2003 indicate that the monthly per capita income of a farmer household, especially that of a small and marginal farmer, is much lower than their per capita consumption expenditure. The poor agriculture income and absence of non-farm avenues of income increase the vulnerability of the farmer. Those engaged in growing crops like cotton are engaging in high-risk agriculture. Indian farmers are many times directly competing with foreign farmers, which leads to the falling of the prices. In such situation, they may be left holding the crop without even recovering the investment. We have seen in newspaper reports, on television, that how farmers, when the prices fall, they burn their own produce, like farmers in Maharashtra destroying tomatoes. Reason for high rate of farmer suicides in India, let's understand. Obviously, this is a colonial phenomena, but India still has a poor irrigation system. There's an inferior quality of crop in many cases, for example, cotton, growing cost of inputs such as seeds, fertilizer, technology and tools, lack of accessible formal credit structure, increased dependence on informal private money lenders, lack of respective industry lobbies to push for their cause, lack of industries with agriculture. Agriculture is a high capital investment and infrastructure which pressurizes the farmer to compete without adequate state support. The farmer is caught in the vicious circle of non-viable, capital-intensive, free market regulated agriculture that committing suicide to escape the drudgery and increasing indebtedness seems to be the only viable option. Farmer suicide are a combination of complex factors: indebtedness incurred due to high capital-intensive farming, leading to sale of assets, greater reliance on credit to repay old debts, increased debt burdens, crop failure due to higher dependence on nature, combined with glut in the market, pushes the farmer to increased levels of risk. Along with this, the loss of faith in community due to harassment by creditors and or loan agent pushes farmer to take their own lives by commit suicides. Thus, agrarian policies have not been of great priority for the government, specifically the rural financial policies. The new policy regime of the liberalized government regarding financial sector reform has grossly neglected the rural credit delivery system. True to the neoliberal policies, formal institutions are declining and the state pushes credit delivery system such as microcredit groups to play an important role in dealing with the rural credit demand. It has been pointed out that within the development discourse of this decade, the question of marginalization of rural people in general and those dependent on agriculture has lost priority. Scholars like Jyotka argue that liberalization policies of the Indian state rendered the small farmer in India to fend for themselves in the competitive, free and regulated market, which crushed them to the core. On the other hand, while the agrarian sector is lagging behind, it continues to employ a large proportion of the workforce. As the returns from agriculture are falling drastically, it pushes the farmers in India to multitask and increase their income just to stay above the poverty line. But this situation is rendered more critical with the absence of viable non-farm employment and other avenues of income. High dependence on agriculture-based employment has led to increased casualization of employment. To conclude, I would like to point out that high investment and low return based on agricultural practices has resulted in indebtedness among the farmers. Poor and non-farm employment opportunity increase the vulnerability of the farmers, pushing them to commit suicides. Structural inequalities due to fragile agrarian condition are so deeply entrenched that access and control of land by women farmers also do not provide them with adequate support to deal with poverty and extreme hardship. Thus, agriculture in India is now a completely market-based venture, and an unregulated market makes farmer vulnerable and at an increased risk to take their life. The situation is sad and it's a worrisome plight for which the government, the public policy makers should do as much they can. Review the policies and take the farmer interest central while understanding their problem, designing various approaches to solve the misery that the farmer is undergoing, and give back the respect that the agriculturalist had in days before. Thank you.